Okay, so today's lecture topic is how development varies between countries, and these slides were designed to accompany the textbook, The Cultural Landscape. And so the first thing we need to talk about is we need to go ahead and define that term development a little bit more, and this is actually a really great definition that I happen to like. And the definition is the process of improving the material conditions of people through the diffusion of knowledge and technology. And I like this definition for a few reasons. One is that it focuses on people, okay, not countries, but the material conditions of the people who live in the countries. And then also it focuses on the diffusion of knowledge and technology, which is the thrust of a lot of modern development efforts, is how do we improve people's lives by spreading that knowledge and by spreading those technologies. Classic development models focus on really two tiers. They have our more developed countries, call those MDCs, or they're also known sometimes as developed countries. And then we've got our lesser developed countries. We call these LDCs, or they're also oftentimes known as emerging or developing countries. Modern models also include a middle level that shows some of the traits of the more developed countries and some of the traits of the less developed countries. Say, for instance, might have a larger manufacturing sector and a higher quality of life than the less developed countries, but they don't they're not, a lot of their manufacturing might be managed or might be, the orders might be placed from the more developed world. Okay, so they're exploited by the more developed world for their cheap labor and the like, but they also develop those, or they also exploit those lesser developed countries by using resources and oftentimes even cheap labor from those countries. So then we can start to dig into that question of how does development vary between countries. And one of the indicators that we oftentimes use, and we haven't really talked about this in class yet, is the Human Development Index, which was developed by the United Nations as a way to assess a country's level of development. And it's really based on four factors. First is economic. Okay, and to measure economic well-being, they take the gross domestic product per capita, and remember, GDP per capita just means the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country in a given year, and then we take that number and we divide it by the total number of people. Okay, then there's two social factors that we use. The first of which is literacy, and so we take that as a percent of the population, how many people can read and write in their native language, or really in any language, and then what's the average amount of education people receive. Okay, and then the last factor we use is demographic, and for that one we take life expectancy. And life expectancy, remember, is the number of years the average person can expect to live. So when we look at our map here, what we've got, and this map, by the way, was developed in 2011, which means its data is probably from about 2009. Okay, but what we see is our highly developed countries, no surprise there, right? And these are ones where the index gives them an average of 0.9 or higher, and that's out of a 1.0 scale. Okay, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, right, Japan, Australia. Some surprises you might see in there. Singapore, for instance, is that little red dot. In Malaysia, trying to remember what country that is. Right around the, I think it's the UAE, right on the toe of the boot. For Saudi Arabia, okay, and Israel in there. So you do see some little surprises, but overall, there's no real surprises there. Then we've got kind of our high mid, right, 0.7 to 0.89. And these are really, I would call these our mid-level developing countries. Okay, so Mexico, most of South America, almost all of Asia, large parts of the Middle East, North Africa. And these numbers, by the way, might have changed a little bit just because of some of the unrest, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. And then we've got kind of our mid-level countries, right? Perfectly mid-level, and we're talking about our scale more or less. And those are countries like India, Nigeria. Let's see, that should be Yemen, I believe, on the heel of the boot of Saudi Arabia, right? South Africa and some of the countries right by there. And so forth. And then we've got our less developed countries, basically the whole middle part, so West and Southern Africa. I got a handful of countries for which there is no data, which just means there's no reliable way to gather or no reliable numbers to use to decide what that development index might be. So it's not they're super underdeveloped, although certainly the inability to collect data is a very big indicator of that potentiality. It just means that there's no reliable numbers, right? So how does economic development vary among countries? Again, we can talk about those economic indicators of development, right? We did this a little bit with the last unit, talk about types of jobs. So if most of your folks work in the primary sector, so they're doing resource extraction, agriculture, and that kind of thing, you're a lesser developed country. If a lot of your folks work mostly in the secondary sector, that manufacturing sector, you're kind of in the middle. You're not less developed, but you're also not more developed yet. Then if you've got a country that's almost entirely folks working in the tertiary sector, so they're not manufacturing things, they're not extracting resources, but what they're really doing is service, then what you're looking at is a more developed country. Okay, and then we talk about productivity. The way we measure that is we measure the value added, and what that means is what a product, we take what something was worth before we dealt with it and did something to it, and what it's worth after, and that difference, that's the value added. So we take that, basically the total amount of value added, and we divide it by the number of people, right? And that's where we get that per capita number. More developed countries are always going to be more productive than less developed countries, and this makes sense. Better access to technology and better ways to measure that kind of stuff, right? And more physical stuff being produced. You can also look at consumer goods and how many consumer goods people are consuming. So as a way to kind of take a look at that, we could look at is motor vehicles per person, and this is a good measure just because motor vehicles are really a luxury item for the most part. I mean, people existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years before motor vehicles, and they'll continue to exist if motor vehicles go suddenly absent, right? But what you can see is that in countries that are more developed, they have more consumer goods, right? Makes sense. They've got more cash to throw around and more cash that they can spend on higher price goods, and cars definitely are higher priced goods, and for the most part motor vehicles, that's what we're talking about, right? If we look at some of those less developed countries, that's when we can start to get into looking at things like motorcycles as a form of motor vehicle. Okay, so I want to make sure that we know that that is absolutely included as well. Right, and again, it roughly mirrors what we saw before. More developed countries have more consumer goods. Some countries have kind of the middle. It's basically the same. And then our lesser developed countries have far fewer goods. None of this should be a surprise. And it's all, again, roughly mirrors, and most development indicators, except around the edges of those different levels, you're not going to see a lot of movement. You might see a little movement within, but countries are not going to jump from one level of development to another very often. Okay, so another way to look at how development varies among countries is to look at social indicators of development, and these are things related to society. Okay, so one of the ways to approximate education levels is to look at the number of people who can read and write. And so what we call that is the literacy rate. And in countries that are more developed, your literacy rate oftentimes is 95 to 99% or higher. Right, certainly here in the US it's that high. But in lesser developed countries, you can get it down as low as, 50% or less. And really 50% is kind of a threshold number because roughly 50% of the population is female. And so if one whole half of your population can't read and you're a lesser developed country, odds are very good, historically especially, but certainly true still today, that that's going to be the female half of the population. We can also look at health and welfare as a way of measuring social well-being, right? So we talk about, are you getting enough to eat? Are you getting adequate calories? Which is not just enough to eat in terms of enough calories to survive, but also the right spread of calories. Talk about access to healthcare. Can you, if you have a serious problem, easily get affordable health care? Can you get access to the emergency room? Or is that something that's just you wouldn't do because you can't afford it? And if you do get access to health care, is it high quality health care? Which is a whole question. So another way to measure some of this is to look at the number of students per teacher, right? Number of teachers being an approximation of how well educated a society is, because you have to have some measure of education if you're going to teach others. Right, so, and primary school, by the way, anytime you see that, think elementary school. That's what we call it here in the States. So you look in the United States, and our average is less than 15. And again, you see that mirrored in large parts of Western Europe, right? You see it mirrored Libya, interestingly enough. And then you see kind of our high mid, right? 15 to 19. That's still not bad. That's still pretty well developed. And so when you see that Canada, you see that in the remainder of Western Europe, all the way through Eastern Europe, right? Australia, some parts of South America like Argentina. Then you see 20 to 29, not great, not bad. I mean, that's about what class sizes were when I was growing up. It's not great, not bad. China, not necessarily a surprise there. And so that's kind of our mid-level development. Roughly similar, not the same, roughly similar to what you saw in the other maps. 30 or more, I mean, start to think about that. They've got so few teachers that they've got to have 30 or more kids in a classroom. Okay, I mean, that's huge. I mean, that's just insanity to try and think of managing that many elementary age kids and getting them all to learn. Then we've got the handful of countries for which, not surprisingly, there's no data, and those countries don't necessarily change. So we've got Somalia, for instance, on the Horn of Africa, and I'm not sure what the other country is in Western Africa there. I want to say it's Mauritania, but I wouldn't swear to it. Okay, so another way to talk about it, we talk about demographic indicators of development. Remember, these are population indicators, okay? So life expectancy. So for instance, a baby born today in a more developed country has a life expectancy of approximately 70 to 73 years thereabouts. In a lesser developed country, 60-ish years. Okay, that's a full decade. And that number's actually gone up a little bit since these slides were designed. It's probably more like the mid-70s. Okay. There are other demographic indicators we could look at. We could look at infant mortality rate, right? How many infants are dying before the age of 2? We could look at the natural increase rate. So how many people are born versus how many people are dying. Smaller natural increase rate equals higher development. As a rule, not entirely true, but as a rule. We could look at the crude birth rate. Again, also a measurement of access to things like birth control, which is another indicator of development. So that's been our slide to talk about some other ways to measure development. We looked at the Human Development Index and some different factors that we could look at in there, and we looked at a lot of different maps, and what we saw across maps was that where a country measured in terms of high, medium, or low didn't change a whole lot. Again, we saw, there were some outliers where the maps didn't quite match up. But for most of the maps, if you were a well-developed country, you were going to be in that higher scheme in terms of the colors, right? And if you were a less developed country, you're going to be in that lower scheme. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come see me, and I'd be delighted to answer whatever questions you have, and I will look forward to seeing you in class.